Hi, I'm Claire and I was turning 31. But honestly, it felt like I was celebrating years of being the family's invisible afterthought. Have you ever felt like your own blood was waiting for you to fail, just so they could feel superior? That night, my brother Ethan, the golden boy, made sure every ear in the upscale Chicago restaurant heard me described as unemployed. My cheeks were burning and the shame was crushing me. Then Ethan delivered the final calculated insult. Just as I hit my breaking point, a waiter approached our table. What he said next shattered my brother's perfect performance and flipped the script on 2 decades of injustice. Stick around because this is the story of how I stopped begging for respect and started earning a payback they never saw coming. It was supposed to be my 31st birthday celebration, but instead my older brother Ethan turned it into a masterclass in public humiliation. The Sterling Room, a new upscale restaurant in downtown Chicago, was buzzing with polite laughter and the gentle clinking of expensive glasses. I felt the familiar tension coil in my stomach the moment I walked in, a feeling I'd carried around my family since childhood. That night, however, the knot felt tighter knowing what was coming. The moment we were all settled at the large reserved table, my father Robert, my mother Evelyn, Ethan, and his wife Veronica, the performance began. Ethan, the golden boy of the family's successful real estate developer and walking billboard for nepotism, immediately launched into a monologue about his quarterly returns. He spoke loudly about reallocating his shares in the tech sector and the stock options he had just purchased, making sure to reference exact figures like 12,000 units or a purchase price of $52.20. My parents nodded approvingly, their eyes shining with the pride that was never quite there when they looked at me. I was Claire, the younger sister, the artistic one, the one who took the unsecure path, and for the past 2 years the conveniently unemployed one, at least in their eyes. Then came the moment I knew was inevitable. Ethan leaned back in his leather chair, the smirk spreading across his face like a slow toxic bloom. He took a long sip of his $150 wine before dropping the bomb loud enough for the entire nearby table of 4 to hear. Still unemployed, Claire. My goodness, I just can't believe it. You're turning 31 today and you're still living in that same rented shoebox near the lake. Can you even afford to be here tonight without borrowing from Mom again? Or maybe selling some of those little paintings of yours? The air froze solid. My mother Evelyn, who was meticulously cutting a piece of roasted duck, dropped her fork with a sharp clank against the fine china. My father Robert sighed deeply, the sound heavy with weary disappointment, and pinched the bridge of his nose. Veronica, Ethan's wife, a social climber who loved showing off her emerald earrings and name-dropping their last vacation to the Amalfi Coast, giggled, barely hiding her delight behind her champagne glass. I wanted to melt into the floor, to vanish into the deep, warm lighting and expensive decor of the Sterling Room. My cheeks burned with a searing heat that was not just embarrassment. It was the sting of raw betrayal and the weight of 2 decades of blatant favoritism. There it is. I thought, my mind terrifyingly clear. The annual reminder of my failure delivered with cruel precision. I stared down at the small, untouched chocolate torte on the plate before me, the single candle flickering wildly, reflecting the inner storm I was desperately trying to contain. Ethan was doing this on purpose. This was not concern. This was a calculated public manipulation designed to reaffirm his position as the worthy son and me as the family failure. He even brought up that tired accusation about me being a parasite on the family name when he mentioned Mom's money. But this time something was different. Underneath the shame and the crushing injustice, a cold, hard resolve had settled in my gut. They thought they saw a broken woman, but all I felt was control. They had no idea what I had been secretly building in the shadows, while they dismissed me as just a daydreaming artist. They assumed I was broke, but they only ever looked for the kind of money Ethan had loud, visible, easily bragged about. The kind of money that buys a big house and a fancy car. Mine was different. Mine was quiet. Mine was lethal. I forced myself to stay calm, lifting my gaze from the dessert to meet Ethan's smug, triumphant eyes. Before I could utter the single measured sentence I had prepared, a figure appeared beside our table. It was Michael, one of the senior waiters, dressed in a crisp, dark uniform, his expression usually professional, but now bearing a specific practiced respect that made my heart hammer in my chest. He carried a small polished brass sign, the kind used for reserving the most exclusive space in the house. Michael bowed slightly, not to the table but directly to me. He spoke clearly, his voice cutting through the remaining tension. "Excuse me, Madam Claire. Welcome back, owner." The silence that followed was absolute, a powerful vacuum that sucked the air out of the room. My mother's breath hitched in her throat, the sound a sharp, audible gasp. My father's frown of disappointment snapped into a look of sheer stunned shock. And Ethan choked. His eyes went wide and he started sputtering, grabbing his napkin as a sudden frantic cough seized him, nearly spitting out the $150 wine. He dropped the wineglass, though luckily it did not shatter. Michael continued, oblivious to the chaos he had unleashed. "Your private VIP room is ready as requested. The one you use for shareholder meetings. We've stocked the wine cellar with the '99 vintage you prefer. Owner-shareholder meetings." Ethan slammed his hand on the table, forcing the air back into his lungs. "What did you just say?" he demanded, his voice raspy and loud. "Did you call her the owner? This is a joke, right? She's unemployed. She can barely afford the bus fare to get here." I did not offer an explanation. I did not defend myself. I did not even correct Michael, who now looked slightly confused by the shouting. I simply let the weight of that single word, owner, settle over my toxic family drama like a heavy blanket. I finally managed a slow, genuine smile, one that reached my eyes for the first time that night. I pushed my chair back, the sound of the polished wood scraping against the marble floor loud and decisive. "Excuse me," I said, my voice soft but steady. "I have some business to attend to." My heels clicked against the floor as I walked past the bewildered faces of my family and toward the plush velvet curtain leading to the back of the restaurant. Each click was like a metronome, marking the slow, steady rhythm of control I had reclaimed. They think they know my story, but they've only ever seen the version Ethan wanted them to believe, the weak, broke sister. They think this is the end of the night. They could not have been more wrong. This was only the beginning of the payback. I will take you back to how this all began, when a whispered secret and the reading of a will set me on the path to revenge. As I walked toward the velvet curtain leading to the private VIP room that night, the room my brother Ethan believed I could not afford to stand near, let alone own, I could still hear his voice echoing in my head. Still unemployed. That insult was not new. It was just the latest verse in a toxic song I had been forced to listen to my entire life. To truly understand why Ethan thought he could humiliate me so easily, you need to know the family I grew up in. Ethan and I were raised in the same suburban house outside Detroit, but our childhoods might as well have belonged to two different families. He was the golden boy, athletic, loud, and effortlessly confident, the kind of son my father Robert could parade as his heir. My parents covered the living room walls with Ethan's trophies, his graduation photos, his first business feature in a local magazine. And me, I was Claire, the younger sister, the bookish one, the girl scribbling plans in notebooks and secretly dreaming of restaurants. To them it was cute but never serious. I was a shadow standing beside Ethan's spotlight. I will never forget Thanksgiving when I was 15. Ethan, then 17, announced he had received a partial baseball scholarship. The kitchen erupted, my mother. Evelyn burst into proud tears, my father raised his best crystal glass, and every relative clapped as though the boy had been crowned king. 3 days earlier, I had won a statewide essay contest. I had worked for weeks on that piece, pouring my heart into every line. That night when I tried to mention it, my mother waved her hand with a distracted smile. "That's nice, honey, but an essay won't pay the bills." The moment dissolved like it had never happened. Their celebration of him drowned me out completely. The coldness was immediate and piercing. Years later, the pattern never changed. Ethan was still the axis around which the family turned, and I remained the afterthought orbiting him. Every time I reached for an artistic or creative path, my father would sigh heavily, confirming that I was choosing instability. But the night that cut the deepest came when I was 27. Christmas dinner glowed with the warmth of lights and laughter, but not for me. Ethan announced his engagement to Veronica, and my parents nearly smothered him in gifts, a down payment on a condo, a vintage watch. The same week marked my own birthday. No one remembered. Not a card. Not a word. I sat there quietly sipping water, the weight of invisibility pressing harder than the cold December air. I felt the familiar shame, yes, but also a growing cold fury. That was the night I understood something essential: I could wait forever for their approval and never get it. My worth would never be written into their will, never be wrapped in ribbon like Ethan's gifts. If I wanted a future, I had to build it in secret, brick by silent brick. So I watched. I studied. I worked. Every late-night shift in a failing cafe, every greasy catering gig, every weary hour balancing books. I was not paid to manage. I stored it all away. My journals are filled with notes, inventory, math, lease negotiations, supplier tricks. What they dismissed as hobby jobs were actually my blueprint. They thought I had nothing. They could not see that while they mocked me, I was sharpening my blade in silence. And one day when the moment came, I would use it. By the time I turned 25, my family had already filed me away under lost causes. Ethan dominated every holiday dinner with tales of his latest real estate deals and booming shares. My parents beamed at him like he carried the family legacy on his shoulders. Then, without fail, my mother would turn to me with that sigh of pity. So Claire, still working part-time, I would smile tightly and nod. They thought I was drifting, stuck in low-wage jobs. What they never saw was that every late shift, every tip counted, every mistake in a failing cafe became a lesson. My notebooks were not filled with poems anymore. They were filled with margins, supplier tricks, and lease terms. I was not wasting time. I was training. The humiliation, however, was relentless. At one family dinner, Ethan raised his glass in a mock toast. Here's to Claire, still paying someone else's mortgage. Renting is the future, right? Veronica laughed. My parents nodded along, and I sat frozen, the burn of their scorn searing into me. They thought they were reminding me of my place. What they did not know was that every jab became steel in my spine. The turning point came when I was 28, serving tables at a truly failing Italian restaurant in Lincoln Park called the Olive Branch. The place was crumbling, poor suppliers, careless staff, a landlord bleeding the business dry. But where others saw failure, I saw a blueprint. I watched the flow of customers, the holes in management, the way loyalty could have been built but was not. At night, I sketched plans in the back of my notebook: menus, events, service standards, under a name that pulsed like a secret promise: the Sterling Room. Around then, I reconnected with Maya, my old college friend now working in hospitality finance. She did not laugh at my journals. She called them what they really were: a feasibility study. Maya became my lifeline, teaching me how loans worked, how to build credit, how to think like an owner. She was the first person who looked at me and did not see failure, she saw potential. The final straw came that Christmas. Ethan handed me a mocking gift, a budgeting book wrapped in shiny paper. Maybe this will help you save for a real career someday, he smirked. My parents chuckled. I excused myself, stepped into the freezing Michigan night, and whispered the vow that had been building for years: one day, you will eat your words inside my restaurant. 3 weeks later, fate answered. The Olive Branch was bankrupt. The landlord wanted to sell cheap, fast, desperate. Everyone assumed I could not afford to be in the room for such a deal. What they did not know was that I had been preparing for this battlefield all along. This was not just a chance. It was the door to my revenge. People often say the deepest pain does not come from strangers, but from the very people who share your blood. For me, that truth became crystal clear during a tense spring family meeting when I was 29. My parents, Robert and Evelyn, called Ethan, Veronica, and me back to the old house in Michigan, stating there was something crucial they needed to announce. I was naive enough to believe foolishly that maybe finally, after years of being overlooked, they might acknowledge my work, my resilience, maybe even the quiet success I had been carving out in the hospitality world. Instead, when I walked into the living room, I was met with a different kind of stage. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and old mahogany. Dust motes drifted through the sunlight slanting from the tall bay windows, catching the frames of Ethan's endless trophies and glossy magazine spreads of his real estate deals. The dining table, the one where we had eaten so many tense Thanksgiving dinners, was no longer set for food but for business. On it lay neatly stacked legal folders, each sealed and waiting. The weight of those papers pressed down on the room like a storm cloud about to break. My parents sat side by side, rigid and formal, as though preparing for a board meeting rather than a family gathering. Ethan and Veronica already looked smug, as if they had been briefed long before I even got the invitation. Veronica tapped her manicured nails lightly against her wine glass, her smirk betraying the satisfaction she did not bother to hide. My father cleared his throat, straightened his tie, and delivered the blow with a cold, almost corporate detachment. To ensure stability of the company and protect our legacy, we have decided to transfer the bulk of the estate to Ethan now while we are alive to guide him. His words fell like stones. He listed it all with surgical precision. This includes the majority shares of Robert Construction, the rental properties, and full management of the stock accounts. His tone carried the finality of a verdict. I watched Ethan lean back in his chair, feigning humility, while his eyes gleamed with triumph. "Thank you, Dad." "I won't let you down," he said. But his voice was not gratitude, it was victory. Then came my turn, the obligatory afterthought. My father sighed, as if even mentioning me was an inconvenience. "As for Claire, daughters marry and start their own families. It's better she not bear the burden of business. We've prepared a modest savings account for her, a rainy day fund." My mother's voice cut in sweet on the surface but sharp as glass beneath. "It's better this way, darling. You will be taken care of. Leave the real responsibilities to your brother." The amount was insultingly small, barely 5% of what Ethan was getting in property alone. Less than an afterthought. Less than a crumb from the feast laid before him. My chest tightened. It was not about the money. It was about being erased, being written out of the family's future as though I had never belonged in it. Ethan, of course, twisted the knife. "I will make sure the Harrison name does not get dragged down by unstable hobbies," he said with mock sympathy, his eyes flicking to me. "Don't worry, Claire. You can still paint or serve lattes, whatever it is you do." The words stung, but it was not his arrogance that froze me. It was the sight of something odd. On the edge of my father's desk, half buried under magazines, I spotted a red-bordered envelope. I recognized the bold font, instantly a mortgage delinquency notice. My parents' empire was not as unshakable as they wanted us to believe. The fortress they were handing over to Ethan had cracks running through its foundation. A cold electric current shot through me. The shock was immediate, but my mind was terrifyingly clear. They had just told me I was worthless, yet they were not even secure in their own wealth. The realization was not just anger. It was clarity. If their foundation was shaking, my small, quiet empire stood a chance. I rose slowly. The legs of my chair scraped against the hardwood, the sound slicing through Ethan's smug monologue. All eyes turned to me. I did not shout. I did not beg. I simply met their gaze with a calm that was sharper than fury. "Understood," I said quietly. My voice carried steadier than I felt. "Thank you for clarifying my place in this family's will." The silence afterward was thick. My mother blinked rapidly. My father frowned in annoyance. Ethan smirked as though I had just admitted defeat. But inside, something different had taken root. On the drive back to Chicago, with the hum of the freeway beneath me, my despair hardened into resolve. They had stripped me of every scrap they could give, but they could not take away what I had built in secret. They could not touch the dream I had been shaping brick by brick. And when I came back, it would not be to beg for scraps. It would be to claim respect, to deliver the kind of justice that only karma can write. The work of revenge had begun. The night my parents officially read out the temporary will, the one that cut me out with surgical precision and handed every meaningful piece of the family legacy, the company, the land, the shares, and the stock accounts to Ethan. I drove back to the cramped apartment I called home. The steering wheel was slick under my palms, not from sweat, but from the sheer weight pressing down on me. I kept replaying their voices in my head, each word like a nail hammered into my chest. By the time I pulled into the cracked driveway of my building, it felt as if the entire world, led by my own blood, had conspired to erase me. But as I stepped inside my tiny kitchen, the air faint with the smell of yesterday's coffee grounds, I bypassed the fridge and reached for the worn notebook sitting on the counter. Its leather cover was soft from years of use, its pages filled with cramped notes and diagrams. Holding it reminded me of something my parents had forgotten. They could give me nothing in their will, but they could not take away the one thing that mattered: knowledge. The skill I had been quietly building in the shadows for 10 years. My secret dream was still alive, hidden, waiting. And then fate cracked open a door I had not expected. At the Olive Branch, the Italian restaurant where I was still working, the air had grown heavy. Each night the dining room felt more hollow, the candlelight flickering over empty tables instead of couples laughing over pasta. The hum of conversation had dwindled to silence, broken only by the clatter of plates in the kitchen. The owner, Mr. Giancarlo, wore the kind of exhaustion you cannot hide, sagging shoulders, eyes rimmed red, his tie perpetually loosened. One afternoon he called me into his cramped, paper-strewn office. The blinds rattled in the draft from the broken window dust floating in the slanted light. His voice was thick with defeat as he said the words that made my pulse slam in my ears: "Claire, I can't service the debts anymore. This place is days away from closure. I'm losing everything." For him it was an ending. For me it was the foundation of an empire. He explained the building owner, weary of chasing unpaid rent, wanted to sell the property and equipment at a fire sale price. The staff outside whispered in anxious huddles, worried about unemployment. But as I listened, my heart raced, not with fear but with possibility. All I saw was the blank canvas of my dream. The Sterling Room could be born here. My first instinct was to call Maya, my college friend, and one of the few people who ever believed in me. She listened, her voice sharp and direct. "Claire, an SBA loan might be possible, but you will need a flawless business plan. And remember, you do not have assets or collateral. They will see the risk before they see you." Her warning did not slow me. It only ignited me. For 3 weeks, my apartment looked like a war room. Papers were taped across every wall. Spreadsheets, supplier contracts, menu drafts, cash flow projections. My floor was littered with crumpled notes. I slept 4 hours a night, jolting awake with new ideas, fueled by the memory of Ethan's smirk when he called me unemployed. My hands shook constantly, but not from fatigue, from adrenaline. I detailed everything: the farm-to-table sourcing strategy, the loyalty programs to draw locals, the exact timing from kitchen to table. I calculated napkin costs, candle burn times, even the water usage per shift. My plan was not a dream anymore, it was a battle map. When Maya finally secured me a meeting with a senior loan officer, I walked into the bank with my best clothes and my thick binder of plans. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and polished wood, the kind of place that made you feel small before you even sat down. The officer skimmed my proposal, his face unreadable. Then he pushed it back across the desk with a flat voice: "You have no significant capital, no history in ownership, no assets for collateral. Restaurants are a high-risk venture." Declined. The single word drained the color from the world around me. I stumbled out into the Chicago rush hour crowd, the city's noise crashing against me like waves. For a moment I felt smaller than ever, like the unemployed failure they had branded me. But Maya caught my arm. "Claire, listen to me. They see risk. You need to think like a developer, not a borrower. Go back. Negotiate differently." Her words struck a spark. That night, instead of collapsing, I returned not to the bank but to the landlord. I knew desperation when I saw it. I made my offer: a 15-year lease with profit sharing for the first 5 years and an ironclad option to purchase the property. No one in my family, least of all Ethan with his loud stock portfolios, would have considered such a creative structure. But I did. The landlord studied my proposal, his eyes narrowing. My detailed financials showed lean overhead, strategic community outreach, and stable long-term potential. He hesitated, but then slowly he nodded. He wanted certainty. I was offering it. We signed the deal. I emptied every cent I had saved, scraped together the insulting rainy day fund my parents had thrown at me, and combined it with a small loan Maya had secured. It was enough. Barely. The olive branch, with its scratched tables and grease-stained tiles, was mine. The keys felt heavy in my hand, not just metal, but destiny. A few days later, as I carried boxes of supplies into the empty shell, I stopped at a nearby coffee shop. By chance, I overheard Ethan's old college friends. "Did you hear about Ethan's high-rise project completely underwater? He leveraged everything on his dad's shares and the market turned. He's screwed." I smiled into my cup. Ethan's empire of loud, visible money was crumbling. My quiet empire was just beginning. Back at the restaurant, I walked across the silent dining room. Dust clung to the air. Broken chairs leaned against the walls like abandoned soldiers. But to me, it was holy ground. I stood in the center, the echo of my footsteps surrounding me, and whispered the vow I had carried for years. The day they call me unemployed will be the day I bring them here, and they will have to call me by another name, the owner. The air was cold, the lights dim, but inside me something blazed. The stage was set. The day I signed the lease and officially took over the deserted Italian restaurant, everyone who knew me, or thought they knew me, was certain I had lost my mind. My own brother Ethan chuckled when he heard the news, dismissing it with a sneer. "Claire knows nothing about business. She's just playing house with burned food." My mother Evelyn called me not to congratulate me, but to scold me. "You're not strong enough, dear. Don't humiliate yourself further and drag our family name through the mud." But they never saw what came next. They never saw the long, lonely nights where I sat in that hollowed-out kitchen, my hands trembling as I traced the outlines of my business plan on the greasy prep table, the pages smudged with flour and ink. They did not hear the way silence pressed in around me, broken only by the distant hum of the city outside. My hands shook partly from fear, but mostly from the fire that whispered, "Do not fail. Do not give them the satisfaction." The olive branch was a wreck. The walls exhaled dampness like a tired old man. The ceiling fans groaned with each turn, and the kitchen equipment coughed and wheezed as though it resented being brought back to life. The dining chairs wobbled, their varnish scratched raw by years of neglect. A full renovation was impossible. I did not have Ethan's endless stream of stock market cash or the inheritance that had been handed to him like a crown. I had only grit, so I became everything. My own general contractor, my own electrician, my own janitor, my own painter. The smell of paint thinner and plaster dust clung to my hair for weeks. My palms blistered from hauling boxes, my nails cracked from scrubbing grease that seemed centuries old. The drill screamed in my ears late into the night, drowning out my heartbeat, which whispered the same mantra: keep going. Do not fail. Do not give them the satisfaction. The financial strain was merciless. My checking account hovered on the edge of empty, the numbers taunting me with their red glow on the ATM screen. One Friday afternoon, I sat in my car, staring at two bills, the electricity payment and the produce order for the weekend. The freezers would die without power. The kitchen would die without food. My wallet held only a few wrinkled bills. Tears burned in my eyes, but I swallowed them down. I whispered into the stale air of my car. Not yet. Not until I have earned my payback. Even my staff, the few I managed to hire, doubted me. They whispered that I was another dreamer destined to collapse. Some left mid-shift, slamming their aprons on the counter, as if to say, "I told you so." That betrayal felt familiar, a bitter echo of family dinners where I had been left invisible. But instead of crumbling, I tied on an apron myself, stepping onto the line, chopping, sautéing, serving. I refused to let the place close even for one night. If no one else believed this restaurant had a soul, I would be its soul. Then, on a rainy Tuesday evening, the first crack of hope arrived. A group of soaked university students stumbled in shaking water from their jackets. They ordered a simple pasta dish my carbonara perfected after countless failed attempts. The steam curled upward, carrying the rich scent of parmesan and pepper. When they ate, they looked at each other with wide eyes. One of them laughed aloud, delighted. Another snapped a photo, posting it online with the words, "Hidden Gem Alert." That post was a pebble dropped into water. The ripples began almost immediately. Locals came curious. Then they came back loyal. Slowly, the cavernous dining room began to glow with life glasses, clinking silverware, tapping laughter, weaving through the air like music. Meanwhile, my family's mockery continued. At the next Thanksgiving dinner, Ethan lifted his glass smugly. "Claire's still playing at the restaurant," he announced, a hobby business. "I just signed a new contract, 10,000 more shares in a tech firm. That's real money. Not flipping omelets." My parents nodded, eyes glittering with pride. I said nothing. My silence was sharper than any retort. Inside I was ice. "Keep talking, Ethan. Keep bragging. While you are loud, I am building." I turned deeper toward the community, hosting live music nights, sponsoring the local soccer team, offering discounts to neighborhood regulars. The restaurant became not just a place to eat, but a part of people's lives. The empty silence was replaced by warmth, by belonging. And then came the test that could have undone me, an unannounced health inspection. My heart nearly stopped when the inspector walked in, clipboard in hand. Every fear screamed in my mind. They will shut me down. I missed something. This will end here. But they did not. Thanks to the obsessive journals I had kept for years, the ones my family had mocked as overanalyzing, we passed. Not just passed with commendation. That night after the inspector left, I locked the door and leaned against it, the air still warm with the hum of satisfied diners. The streetlights painted the windows gold. For the first time, I did not see a failing Italian diner. I saw the Sterling Room, my masterpiece, my sanctuary, my revenge in progress. I whispered into the quiet, my voice steady. One day my family drama will end right here. They will sit at one of these tables, and they will never again call me unemployed. The stage was set. The curtain was about to rise. It was my 32nd birthday, and unlike all the others before, I walked into that celebration with a secret so powerful it hummed under my skin like electricity. My family thought this would be another spectacle of humiliation, the annual ritual of mocking the unemployed daughter. But I had already rehearsed my silence, my smile, and the precise moment I would flip the narrative. The restaurant gleamed that night. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden shimmer across polished marble floors, the air rich with truffle and expensive Bordeaux. Guests in tailored suits filled the dining hall with the low murmur of business deals. My family sat at the center of it all. My mother, Evelyn, father, Robert, Ethan, and his wife, Veronica, flanked by a few of their influential friends. They did not know they were inside my empire. The Sterling Room. As the courses passed, I let Ethan play his usual role. He bragged about market surges, dropping percentages and stock tips like coins into an empty jar. Veronica laughed on cue, flashing her jewelry as though wealth were contagious. My parents nodded dutifully, each word a needle driven deeper into the part of me they believed would never heal. But it did not sting anymore. Not tonight. Ethan raised his glass, eyes glinting. "Tell me, Claire, still pretending to run some little cafe? Or did you finally give up that hobby?" I did not flinch. I studied each face, my father's frown, my mother's pity, Veronica's smirk. Ethan leaning back, basking in what he thought was dominance. What none of them noticed was how the staff glanced at me not with disdain, but with a quiet, practiced respect. They knew. The walls knew. This was my stage, and I had written the script. Then came the cue. Michael, my trusted maitre d', approached with calm precision. He placed a polished brass sign gently on the table and bowed. "Happy birthday, Miss Claire. The owner's VIP room has been prepared. The staff is waiting and the corporate clients are ready whenever you are." The air collapsed into silence. My mother's fork slipped clattering like a gunshot. My father's breath caught in his throat. Veronica's painted smile cracked, and Ethan went scarlet, sputtering into his champagne. "She's not. She can't. This is some trick," he barked, desperate. I let the silence stretch. Then I rose, adjusting my dress, each step deliberate, each movement an assertion of control. "If you would like to see the truth about the place I supposedly can't afford to be in," I said softly, meeting Ethan's wild eyes, "follow me." My heels echoed against the marble as I walked toward the velvet-draped entrance. Behind me, their chairs scraped the floor, hesitation dragging their bodies forward. When I opened the frosted glass door to the VIP lounge, the scene was already set. My staff aligned, waiting, their voices rising in unison. "Happy birthday, boss!" I stepped aside, allowing my family to see not just the room, but the reverence, the order, the empire they had sworn I would never build. This was not a simple reveal. This was the first cut of justice. The moment the story changed. The heavy glass door of the VIP lounge clicked shut behind me, finally muffling the noise of the celebratory dinner outside. The staff members, my staff, bowed slightly. "Happy birthday, boss." The tension in the small private room was so thick it was almost suffocating. My parents' eyes and the eyes of my brother Ethan and his wife Veronica were locked on me, shifting between disbelief and confusion. For years they had called me unemployed, a burden, while Ethan flaunted his ownership of everything: the company, the real estate, the easy access to shares and stock that should have been split between us. But here they were, trapped, sitting in the very restaurant I owned. For the first time in my life, my silence carried more weight than all the arrogant boasting Ethan had ever done. My mother Evelyn sat rigidly, her face pale, the shock draining the color from her skin. My father Robert was visibly angry, his jaw clenched. He was the first to break the silence, his voice a low, hostile growl. "Claire, are you playing some kind of sick joke on us?" Ethan, however, was still trying to find the angle, the loophole, the quick explanation that would put him back in control. He crossed his arms tightly against his chest, narrowing his eyes. "What kind of elaborate scam is this? You bought a franchise? Did you win the lottery? This is not a serious business, Claire. This is some pathetic attempt at revenge for the inheritance." I looked at them one by one. I allowed myself a moment to simply absorb their discomfort. Then I spoke. My voice was calm, clear and steady, nothing like the timid sound of the girl who used to rush out of Thanksgiving dinner just to avoid their mockery. "In the years that you were busy congratulating yourselves and comparing stock portfolios, I was working 3 different jobs, sleeping 4 hours a night and saving every single dime," I explained. "This building was failing. I saw the weakness and I saw the potential. I used my savings, my knowledge, and the help of a silent partner, a family member you pushed away as you always do, to take control. This restaurant, the Sterling Room, belongs to me. And tonight, every one of you is simply a guest." Ethan scoffed a truly contemptuous sound. He threw his head back and laughed a loud, barking laugh that was meant to crush me. "A diner. An overpriced place that serves fancy pasta. You honestly think that compares to my construction company? The $4.3 million in assets and all the properties I control. You are playing a child's game, Claire. These are small potatoes." He was trying to minimize my years of hard work, just as he had done since we were children. I did not argue the point of size. I did not need to. I reached over to the side table, picked up a sleek, leather-bound folder, and placed it directly in front of Ethan. "Small potatoes, you say?" I countered, my eyes burning into his. The numbers speak for themselves. This is the quarter's revenue report. And this, I lifted, a second page, is a list of our corporate clients. We host all the major events for the 3 largest investment banks in downtown Chicago. Our menu has 5-star ratings across every platform, and our VIP rooms are booked out a month in advance. I did not need your company or your stock to prove my worth. The sheer volume of my success is my proof. Just as the silence threatened to explode, the door opened. Michael, my trusted manager, stepped in, looking slightly agitated. He did not interrupt the tension. He amplified it. He bowed his head slightly toward me. "Boss, I apologize for the interruption, but the corporate clients from Oakhaven Group just arrived. They want to finalize the agreement for the year-long series of events. It's an enormous contract. Send them to my private office, Michael," I instructed smoothly. "I will be there in 10 minutes. Michael nodded and left. The faces of my parents and brother were frozen in disbelief. This was no lucky waitress or temporary unemployed girl's hobby. This was a sophisticated business operation. My mother Evelyn was the first to show a crack of genuine feeling. Her voice was weak, laced with a plea I had not heard before. Claire, why? Why did you not tell us? We could have helped? That question was the final dagger. I looked at her and the anger I had bottled up for decades surged. Because for my entire life, not a single person in this family ever bothered to listen to me. You only ever heard what Ethan wanted you to hear. You wanted to see failure, so you did. Ethan finally lost his composure. He shot up, pointing a trembling finger at me across the table, his face a mottled crimson mask of fury. You are nothing but a spoiled sister who got lucky. You are still just a lucky waitress, and I am the one who holds the company the real shares and stock. I stood up slowly, meeting his rage with icy calm. You hold the company, Ethan, but I hold the respect. I earned it dollar by dollar, night by night, and tonight, you cannot buy that respect with any amount of your precious stock. The room was absolutely silent. The air was thick with defeat and the bitter taste of karma. All eyes were on Ethan the golden boy, whose carefully constructed facade had just crumbled around him. My final thought before the door opened again for the waiting corporate client was a whisper of absolute power. This is just the beginning, brother. You will soon know what it means to lose absolutely everything. Ethan was about to speak again, his face a mottled mask of pure fury and humiliation. But right at that moment, the door to the VIP lounge opened. It was not Michael the manager this time. It was the entire management team, Michael, the lead sommelier, 2 serving staff, and even Chef Antoine, the celebrated executive chef. They filed in standing in a neat line and they bowed in unison. Happy birthday, boss. Happy birthday, Miss Claire, our owner. It did not need to be said. The entire team had just declared the hidden truth for me. In that split second, the entire dynamic of the room reversed. The person they had scorned, the one they had called unemployed and a burden, was now being addressed by the 2 words Ethan never thought would belong to me, boss. My mother, Evelyn, looked like she might faint. My father, Robert, gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. Ethan, still standing slowly, sank back into his chair, utterly defeated by the display of loyalty. This was not just a restaurant. This was a well-oiled machine run by people who genuinely respected me, not feared me. Michael stepped forward, holding a sleek tablet. Boss, we have prepared the final draft of the new corporate contract as you instructed. I just need your final signature before we present it. Chef Antoine, who was rarely seen outside the kitchen, added, and the new winter menu is ready. I wanted to thank you, Miss Claire, for trusting me with the development of the 5-star dishes. The sight of the kitchen staff, the heart of any restaurant, showing me such deference was the ultimate blow to my parents. They had always valued the company workers, the real business people. But here was the highest form of professional respect, and it was directed at the person they had pushed out. Just then, as if choreographed by the hand of karma itself, the door opened one more time. It was not one of my staff, but a large group of impeccably dressed business people. They were powerful clients, men and women from Chicago's financial district. A woman in a sharp blue suit, Ms. Elena Rossi, walked straight to our table, completely ignoring my family. She extended her hand to me with a brilliant smile. Claire, happy birthday. We just heard you were in. I wanted to personally wish you well and confirm that contract for the wedding reception and the next 3 large corporate conferences. Working with you has been a pleasure, partner. Partner. The word hit Ethan like a physical blow. Ms. Rossi, a major player in the city, was now calling me her business partner. She mentioned that the restaurant's reputation had grown far beyond the neighborhood, drawing the attention of the entire financial world, the world Ethan constantly boasted he controlled. My mother stared, utterly stunned. You really did all of this? My father remained silent, but his eyes were unstable, darting nervously between me and the confident business partners. For the first time, he was looking at me as an adult, a force not just the shadow trailing Ethan. Ethan, however, could not let go of his last vestige of perceived power. He leaned forward desperately, trying to reassert himself. It's just beginner's luck. One large contract means nothing. My shares and stock still control $4.3 million worth of assets. I smiled gently, placing the revenue report on the table again directly under his nose. Next to it, I placed the fully booked reservation list for the next 6 months. Luck does not generate this kind of data. Ethan, I said softly, this is the result of hard work, knowledge, and the perseverance that no one in this family ever believed I possessed. You saw the weakness in this building. I saw the foundation for an empire. Then came the final, brutal mini-hook. Mr. Robert Chen, one of the business clients, looked curiously at Ethan. Are you Ethan Harrison? I heard about your latest real estate project. Are the financial difficulties true? I heard there was some issue with stock manipulation and securing the second round of funding. The entire table instantly turned on Ethan. His face went stark white. The hidden truth of his failure, which I had only alluded to in my confrontation, was now being exposed by an outsider, a client in front of the very parents who had worshipped him. The staff continued their quiet work, each movement reinforcing my control. Every eye in the family was now focused not on the unemployed sister, but on the brother who was supposed to be the inheritance keeper. Ethan was visibly shaking, barely able to contain his sputtering rage. This changes nothing. I am still the heir to the company, the shares, and the family's reputation, he spat. I remained seated, maintaining my position of unshakable authority. You can keep the company, Ethan. I have the trust of my customers and the loyalty of my staff, and you will soon realize that those things are what truly hold value in this world. Open loop for next chapter. Ms. Rossi extended her hand one last time, a congratulatory smile on her face. Very few people in the hospitality industry maintain the level of integrity you do, Claire. I wish you the best, partner. I shook her hand, looking directly at Ethan. The game was no longer about his shares or his stock. I had the legal documents from my lawyer, a comprehensive plan to expose his betrayal and manipulation. I knew that within 24 hours, he would be forced to make a choice. The rules of the game have changed, I whispered, not to Ethan, but to the invisible spirit of the karma that now settled around our family. That Christmas was colder than any I could remember. Snow had fallen heavy on the Michigan suburbs, muffling the streets in silence. Inside my parents' house, everything looked perfect as always. The massive pine tree stood in the corner of the living room, dripping with golden ornaments and strands of silver tinsel. Its lights blinked softly, casting warm glows across the polished hardwood floor. The air was thick with the scent of cinnamon cloves and roasted meat drifting from the kitchen. But behind the perfection, the atmosphere was unbearable. Ethan, who had lost face in front of my staff and clients just weeks before, had nowhere left to turn. We sat at the long mahogany table, polished so well the candle flames shimmered on its surface. My mother Evelyn had arranged everything meticulously. China plates with gold-trim crystal goblets, filled with Bordeaux silver cutlery lined with military precision. She smiled too brightly. Her voice pitched too high whenever she spoke, as if the decorations could cover the crack running straight through the family. The sound of cutlery against porcelain was louder than usual, sharp, nervous. My father carved the prime rib in silence, his face a rigid mask. Across from me, Ethan sat slumped, his once commanding posture gone. His eyes were ringed with shadows, his suit slightly wrinkled. He looked smaller. Halfway through the meal, he set his wine glass down, not with his old arrogance, but carefully, almost reverently, as if he was placing down a fragile truth. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. Claire, I need your help. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. The clinking of knives and forks ceased instantly. My mother froze a piece of turkey halfway to her mouth. Her hand trembled and the fork slipped clattering against the china with a sound that rang through the tense room. My father's knife hovered midair, then slammed down with a thud. His face turned crimson, but he said nothing. The only sound was the soft, anxious hum of the tree's fairy lights. Ethan's voice was raw, stripped of all the bravado he once wore like armor. The real estate project failed. The banks are circling. Investors have pulled out. The stock options are worthless. If I do not find cash or collateral, I lose everything. His hands shook as he spoke. His champagne flute, once a symbol of his triumph, now rattled against the table, betraying his desperation. He tried to steady himself, but his words came faster, tumbling out with shame. Claire, please, Lend me money, or stand as collateral. Your restaurant has liquidity. Your name has credibility now. I can't do this without you. Evelyn. My mother finally found her voice, but it was trembling, breaking apart with tears. My son. How could this happen? She reached out her manicured fingers, clutching Ethan's sleeve as if she could physically hold back his collapse. Her breath came shallow, uneven. For the first time, she was not the polished hostess. She was a mother terrified of watching her chosen child fall. I sat very still, feeling the weight of their eyes shift to me. The daughter they had once dismissed now silently cast as savior. The glow of the Christmas lights flickered across their faces. My father's fury, my mother's pleading, Ethan's desperation. I thought of every Christmas past, the forgotten birthdays, the mocking gifts, the cheap budgeting book wrapped like a cruel joke. Now the room had turned. The brother who once toasted my failures was begging for my lifeline. I placed my napkin down carefully, the gesture as deliberate as a verdict. My voice was calm, steady, but sharp enough to cut through the heavy air. You once told me I was a burden, Ethan. Tonight you are the one begging. The silence that followed was deafening. The scent of roasted prime rib and pine needles hung in the air, too rich, almost suffocating. My mother sobbed quietly into her hands, the sound fragile against the crackling fire. My father's jaw worked furiously, but he said nothing, perhaps because the truth was undeniable. I stood the chair, scraping against the floor, and looked at them all one last time. The family allowed me to lose everything years ago. Now it is your turn to understand what justice means. As I walked out, the warm lights of the Christmas tree glowed behind me, no longer a symbol of joy, but of irony. That night, karma came wrapped in gold ribbon and pine needles. The chill of that Christmas dinner still lingered, clinging to me like frost that refused to melt. I knew it was only a matter of time before my parents and Ethan came knocking again. The pressure to conform, to be the good sister who fixed the family drama, was immense. And sure enough, just 3 days later, Ethan and my father, Robert, arrived at the Sterling Room. They did not enter as customers. They entered as supplicants. I had them seated in the private VIP lounge, the same room where I had pulled the curtain on their illusions. Tonight, the golden glow of the chandeliers seemed sharper, casting long shadows across the mahogany table. The faint scent of oak wine barrels and polished leather filled the air. The silence was heavy, broken only by the slow tick of the antique wall clock. For me, it felt less like a family reunion and more like a tribunal. Robert spoke first, his voice coated with the practiced sentimentality I knew too well. Claire, he began, folding his hands as though we were in church. Our family must stand united now. You have done remarkably well here, but this is bigger than you. You must use your success, this restaurant, to prove the strength of the Harrison name. Creditors are circling. We need to show them we are one. He let the word family linger in the air, heavy with manipulation. Ethan leaned forward quickly, unable to maintain the illusion of humility. His tone slipped into the familiar sharpness of a deal-maker. Here's the solution, he said flatly. You co-sign a few assets. Guarantee a portion of the debt. In return, I will split the shares and stock with you later. We will rewrite the will properly this time. Simple. I stayed still. My fingers traced the rim of my wine glass, the sound a quiet hum against their rising desperation. I studied them, two men who had always believed they controlled the room, now stripped of that authority, their confidence fraying at the edges. Finally I spoke. My voice was calm, deliberate. You say you will split the shares now. Everything that rightfully belonged to me you took without hesitation. You excluded me from the inheritance, erased me from the will, told me I was a burden. And now that your empire is collapsing suddenly, you remember I exist. Suddenly my bloodline matters. Ethan's jaw tightened. Don't be dramatic, Claire. This isn't personal, it's business. You are being emotional. I let out a short, humorless laugh. No, Ethan. What you do not understand is that it was never just business for me. It was survival. I leaned closer, my words sharp as glass. If you truly considered me family, you would not have treated me like the unemployed punchline at every Thanksgiving dinner. You would not have mocked me when I scraped for rent while you flaunted your stock options. The silence crackled like static. Robert shifted uncomfortably, but Ethan could not stay quiet. You think this restaurant makes you untouchable? He snapped, slamming his palm against the polished wood. If you do not help, I will lose everything. Do you want to watch your brother completely collapse? The air vibrated with his desperation, but before I could respond, the door opened. A group of my newest corporate clients entered dressed in sleek suits, their laughter momentarily filling the tense room. They spotted me immediately. Claire, one of them, beamed, striding over with an outstretched hand. We just wanted to confirm the details for the New Year's reception. We are honored to be partnering with you. Your reputation here is phenomenal. I shook their hand warmly, their words hanging in the air like a verdict. For a moment, Robert and Ethan were invisible, reduced to shadows in the corner. The client saw only me, the owner, the partner, the equal. When they left the room, felt colder. My father's face was pale, his pride fractured. Ethan's eyes burned with humiliation. Robert tried one last time, his voice trembling with the remnants of authority. Claire, you cannot turn your back on your own blood. I rose slowly from my chair, the scrape of wood against marble deliberate final. My gaze swept across them, father and son, both broken in different ways. You are collapsing because of your own choices, I said, my voice steady, echoing in the silent lounge. Not because of me. I learned to stand on my own. I built this empire with no inheritance, no will, no family support. Now it is your turn to learn the lesson you refused to teach me. Robert's head dropped in silence. Ethan stood abruptly, his chair toppling backward. His face was twisted with rage and shame as he stormed out, refusing to look back. I remained standing, watching the door swing shut, the air still vibrating with their absence. Moments later, my phone buzzed. My mother's voice trembled on the line. You truly have changed, Claire, she whispered. I glanced out toward the main dining room where laughter spilled from the tables where my staff moved with precision and pride. No, Mom. I answered softly, watching the city lights glow beyond the windows. I did not change. I just finally became who I always was. And for the first time, I realized I never needed their inheritance. My empire was right here. It's been over 1 year since that fateful birthday night. 1 year since the tables were truly turned and my brother was forced to confront his own fragility. The Sterling Room has transformed completely. The dim lights and dusty corners from the days I first took over are gone, replaced by a vibrant space constantly booked solid. I didn't just build a business. I built a new family. My fiercely loyal staff, my trusting customers, the people who believed in me when my own flesh and blood turned their backs. To me, that is the true meaning of redemption, living in respect and earning affection rather than waiting for a conditional validation that would never arrive. The local Chicago paper ran a feature story just last month, from Unemployed punchline to culinary powerhouse, the rise of Claire Harrison. We signed annual contracts with major corporations, and my restaurant became the go-to destination, especially during major holidays like Thanksgiving dinner and Christmas. The irony is not lost on me. The holidays my parents used to exclude me became the days my new business thrived. Meanwhile, the news about my biological family was quiet but devastating. Ethan lost the company. He was forced to liquidate the remaining real estate assets to cover the debt and legal fees. The shares and stock he had so proudly paraded were indeed reduced to worthless paper. My parents, Evelyn and Robert, now live quietly. The lavish parties are gone. They no longer travel or brag about their inheritance or will at social gatherings. They have become quiet shadows grappling with the consequence of their lifelong favoritism and betrayal. Sometimes I think about that day when they placed the documents on the mahogany table, the will that erased me the inheritance that they said I didn't deserve. Back then it felt like a death sentence, as if my future had been signed away with the stroke of a pen. But now I see it differently. That piece of paper means nothing. That will have no power over me, because my true inheritance isn't something written in legal ink or guarded by family favoritism. My true inheritance is what I built myself: the Sterling Room, the loyalty of my staff, the trust of my customers, and the dignity I claimed back piece by piece. I made no further move for revenge. I didn't need to. The greatest karma was simply allowing them to live within the reality of the failure they themselves created. My real life now happens within the warm walls of the Sterling Room. My staff, Michael the chef, the waiters, they call me boss, but also Claire and often just sister. They organized a surprise party for my last birthday, not a formal tense affair, but a genuine celebration with silly gifts and loud laughter. That night, standing amidst the people who chose to love and respect me, I realized this was the family I had always longed for. I often sit alone after closing, looking out at the city lights. I reflect on everything the years I was mocked as unemployed, the pain of being cut out of the inheritance, the high-stakes confrontation inside that VIP room, and the moment the waiter called me owner. The most profound realization is this: true value doesn't come from the will my parents wrote, or the shares they controlled, or the stock market they worshipped. It comes from what I created with my own two hands and the integrity I refused to compromise. That's the real victory. That's justice. My message to you, the audience, is this: if you have ever been looked down upon, marginalized, or made to feel like a failure by your family or society, remember this: you do not need their permission to succeed. You do not need their inheritance to build your empire. True respect comes from within you and from the community you choose to cultivate. My story ends in redemption, but I want to hear yours. Have you been scorned, pushed aside, only to stand up stronger than ever? Tell me about your journey to payback and self-respect in the comments below. And if you want to keep following compelling emotional journeys of karma and hard-won justice, make sure you hit that like button, comment, and subscribe. We have so many more stories to tell.